I want to welcome you to Dream Chasers Radio with me, your host, Yaya Diamond. What's up, people? How you doing? It is a great day. I'm so very excited. We have Authors Edition today. You know, I have so many different amazing authors on the show, and some of them have done like fiction books, and some of them do children's books. And some of them do autobiographies and things like that, you know, and they've inserted themselves into their fantasy novels or inserted themselves into their books. But this person was the book. This person was not inserted because they wanted to be. They were forced. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Yo, what's up, everybody? I'm Stephen Russell Harge from the group Troop.
And I'm Rodney B from the group Troop.
And we're here kicking it with Yaya Diamond.
Yes.
Always the Yaya. The Yaya.
Welcome back. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If something has happened to you and you want to talk about it and you're open enough to do that, please go ahead and do that in the comments section below. We have an amazing guest today. Miss Sandy Phillips Kirkham is on the show today, and I want to welcome her to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to get into your book, but let's go back a little bit because the book was a manifestation of something that happened to you a while ago. So let's go back to before this happened. Were you a happy child? I mean, tell us about your lifestyle.
Okay, well, I basically had a happy childhood, with the exception that my parents divorced when I was 8. And that was very, very traumatic for me. And I didn't see my dad a lot during that time, especially during my teenage years. So that really had a profound effect on me. We almost immediately moved in with my stepfather, and my mother then had a baby, and then she had 3 more children. And that just kind of added to my vulnerabilities, I think. But I had a great mom. And, you know, I just think at the time, divorce was something that was in the 60s that not many people dealt with. And so it wasn't talked about. And so I had no way to express my grief and sorrow at not having the same family life that I once knew. But overall, it was happy. We didn't attend church, but my church life began because my neighbor up the street invited me to go with them one day, and I absolutely loved everything about it. And that's where I think I found my safe place. I found joy. I found a lot of love there. It was a place that I really, really loved. And as I grew older, I taught Sunday school. I sang in the choir. It was a big part of my life. And I think to say the doors were open, I was there would be not an exaggeration.
I gotcha. Let me jump forward into the future right now for a second. You know, that experience and now today, are you still attending churches today or your church today?
My church life is conflicted. I attended church for 27 years that I had not told anyone about my abuse, but it was more for my children, and I wanted them to have that experience. And so I was very removed from it. I attended, but I didn't participate per se. I'm very uncomfortable when people pray. I do pray, but I'm very uncomfortable with other people praying. And I think that obviously stems back from the fact that my pastor prayed with me. And it's a conflict that I'm dealing with. I will say for 27 years that I attended church without anyone knowing about my abuse was very, very, very hard. I had to steel myself in order to attend. Once I was able to talk about my abuse and be honest about what was done to me, church has become easier. I don't have that same feeling, but I'm still wary of church.
Yeah, I hear you. So let's go back to that moment where the incident happened.
Well,
what occurred? I mean, how did this happen to you?
I think it's important first to understand that, you know, as I said, my involvement in the church was immense, and I loved it. Just after I turned 16, they hired a new youth pastor, and he was very charismatic. He was very dynamic. People just loved him. And within a very short time, he had just transformed not only the youth group, but the entire church. He brought new ideas. He was just very dynamic. I mean, he was treated like a rock star in many ways. So one night after a youth group meeting that was held in my home, he waited for everyone to leave. And then he began to tell me how wonderful I was and how great he appreciated me helping him in his ministry. And then he bent down and he kissed me. It was a very innocent kiss. It wasn't, I was confused by it. At first I thought, I think he just kissed me. But then I immediately went to the thought, well, this is my pastor. He wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. So maybe I've just misunderstood. And so what happened was I babysat for his family in the evenings. His wife worked evenings. So this gave him the perfect opportunity to be alone with me. And we would sit and talk about the Bible. We'd sit and talk about church. And I loved the attention he was giving to me. But gradually and slowly over time, the kissing became more intense. The hugs became longer and lingering. And to a point that after about a year, he had sex with me. And it was at that point that I was 17 at that time. The kiss started when I was 16. But at that point, I couldn't justify it. Before I could kind of brush the kiss off as well, that's just his way of showing affection. And he was a very demonstrative type guy. He was always hugging people and telling them that he loved them. So it was easy for him to kind of make me pretend that this kiss meant nothing. But once the sex happened, I knew that was wrong. And I was just devastated when it happened. I mean, it was horrible. I didn't know what to do. He started undressing me. He had me on the floor. It was traumatic, and all I could do was just ignore what was happening to me. And once he crossed that line, he made sure that he knew that I knew that I couldn't tell anyone, and that if I were to ever tell anyone, I would be responsible for what happened to him, and that I would be blamed. And truth, honestly, I didn't want anyone to know this about me. I had just had sex with my pastor who was married with 2 children. And I couldn't process it. It was, and he had started convincing me that this was God's will, that this was important to his ministry. And to process it was just to accept it, basically, even though I knew it was wrong. And he was kind to me. He was good to me. So I felt this obligation to him. And there were 2 times I tried to get out of the relationship. And each time I tried, he would respond in one of 2 ways. One, he would say, you know that I love you and I need you. He played on my guilt. The other was to become somewhat violent and tell me that I was not worthy of anyone else's love. I was no longer a virgin, so I was no longer pure enough to be with anyone else, and that he was the only one that could love me. And he would go back and forth between those 2 narratives that kept me in a total state of confusion. So that's kind of the beginning of it. The abuse lasted for 5 years until he was caught.
Oh,
A lot to unpack there, isn't there?
oh my gosh.
He
I'm gonna have
became,
to say this. I'm just gonna have to go there. What an asshole.
yes, but a very charismatic and dynamic asshole that no one could recognize his behavior. As I said, people thought he walked on water, and our church exploded in numbers. I mean, his sermons were wonderful. People just came to listen to these sermons. I've often said, had there been a mega church at that time, he would have been the head of a mega church because he was that good. So, that was another factor in my remaining silent, was that I knew that if I were to reveal this, it would be a bombshell. And then I wondered, would anybody believe me? I mean, because he was so revered, that who was I to say what he was doing, and would I be believed? And he made sure that no one would believe me.
That's just nasty.
I mean, bringing the Bible into it and saying this is part of God's will and saying we were married in God's eyes, that's evil. That is evil at its height. To use my faith and my trust in him as a pastor, and my vulnerabilities and my need to have attention and my need to have a father figure, and then to take advantage of that vulnerability and use it for his own sexual gratification.
I'm so sorry that happened to you.
It was rough. It was very difficult. And I think the idea that I didn't feel like I could get out, that I felt trapped, was really the hardest. I felt like I was never going to be married. I'd never have children, that this would be my life, and that this would be over when he said it was over.
Mm. I mean, that's conniving. That's just conniving. That's just,
and that's how these predators operate. They have to find a target. If you think of them as predators and victim as prey, they look for someone who's weak. They look for someone who's vulnerable. And some vulnerabilities could be someone who's going through a divorce. There's been a death in the family, dysfunctional family. There's someone who's been bullied. There's someone who doesn't have high self-esteem. So they see those vulnerabilities and they use those vulnerabilities to pretend like they're going to help them. And that's what he did with me. He was always kind and talking to me about my dad. If anytime I needed to talk to him, he was there. But all of that was a guise in order to get to me sexually and to have power over me. That's all that is. So that's the grooming process. You know, and it's subtle and it's slow. I mean, I said it took him a year before he finally got to the point where he had sexual intercourse with me. They're very patient because they want their prey to be so trusting and know that they will keep their secret before they actually make their move. And even when he kissed me, it was so like innocent that if I were to have said something to anyone, he could have easily brushed it off by saying, oh, she misunderstood. And I just meant to kiss her on the forehead, or, I shouldn't have done it. And it wasn't anything, I meant anything by it. He was testing me to see, well, she's going to let me kiss her. So then, gradually the hugging became more frequent. So they know what they're doing. This isn't an accident. They know what they're doing.
That's just, I can't. The biggest thing I see is that, this is not the only pastor that has done things like this to children. There are pastors out there that do this to females. There's pastors out there that do this to males. There are female pastors and prophetesses that have been caught doing this. Teachers. I mean, you have these people that prey on young children because the young children feel like if they said anything, they would be the outcasts of all their friends, and their family wouldn't. How could their family believe this? I mean, this person is like the upstanding person, the teacher, they're the pastor, they're the prophetess. I'm going to reach out right now and say, if you're going through this, if you feel like you're being groomed right now for something that is just going to lead you in the wrong direction, you need to speak up today. Speak up now.
Yeah. And one of the other things that people need to understand is these predators have had their victims have a dependency upon them. They've been so good to them up to this point. It's not just a matter of exposing them, but now they've become dependent upon their predator because he has provided them self-assurance. He has given them attention that they had lacked. He has helped them with their divorce or the death in the family. And it's not just children that these predators go after. It's adult women. Because when you're in a vulnerable position and you're being counseled by your pastor or your teacher or your psychiatrist, they have a duty and a right to respect the boundaries of their profession. It is always their responsibilities to stay within the boundaries. So it doesn't matter the age of the victim. Now, yes, children automatically should be, they should not be responsible in any way. But even as a teenager, even though I was a minor, because I felt like I was, old enough to know better, and I was like trying to be this mature individual, I felt responsible for it. And adult women can also feel that way. And so we need to recognize that these are predators regardless of their prey. They are abusing their members of their congregation, and they're wolves in sheep's clothing. That's what they are. That's what they are.
That's exactly what they are. So so I know you have a book, and you can lift that up right now. And what's the title of this book? Because I thought this was very inventive of you.
Well, let me pray upon you with the words P-R-A crossed out and P-R-E-Y, because that's what he did. He prayed with me and then he prayed upon me. The book, I wrote the book because I was frustrated by the lack of understanding of how abusers work and understanding the terms grooming, gaslighting, manipulation. People just assumed, well, why didn't you just say no? So I wanted my story to show and play out how this occurred and why it lasted for so long and why for 27 years I couldn't tell anyone. And what was it that triggered, that's finally said to me, you need to tell your story. But I really told the story because I wanted other victims to understand that they weren't alone, and I wanted to help them to see how they may have been groomed and manipulated. Because one of the things that I've thought about over the years so many times was, what if I'd heard someone else's story about their abuse while my own abuse was going on? Would it
Yeah.
have given me the courage to speak up? Would it have given me the understanding to realize that what was being done to me was not my fault, that I had
That's
been
right.
victimized by someone I should have been able to trust in the safest place on earth? So
Mhm.
that was the reason I wrote the book. And I also want to emphasize that while the book is about my abuse and it's my story, and it is a difficult read sometimes in the beginning, it's also a book about healing and hope. It's a
Mm.
book about learning how to heal and what I did to be able to let go of the pain and the suffering that this man imposed upon me. And how after 27 years, I was able to finally say the words, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor.
Wow. You know, after 27 years, how long did it actually take you to literally come to terms and then say something?
Well, I had a trigger that forced me to think about, okay, something's wrong here, I need to let go of this. And so that's what started my journey to say, I need to tell someone. But once I told someone, and I told my best friend, and I told a few other friends, I was hesitant in telling my husband. He was one of the last people that I did tell. And I began to realize that by telling my truth, it was freeing me and that it was okay to say those words. And every fear that I had, it didn't occur. People did believe me, and he wasn't going to do anything to me if I told. So that was how I started. And then it took me probably about 2 years to really, really let go. Because for 2 years I was angry. I was having to deal with the pain and the hurt, because up until that point, I had suppressed it. And up until that point, I felt like I was responsible too. So I saw it as an affair with a married man who was my pastor. And so that's how I saw it. So for 27 years, I framed it that way. And it was once I was able to let go of that guilt and shame that I could finally heal. The other thing I probably need to add, and what added to my guilt and shame, was once he was caught, he was called in by the elders. And I don't know what narrative he told them, but he was forgiven. There was a vote to even keep him as our pastor. And then he was moved to the next church. Shortly after that, I was called in by the elders, and I was told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And I was devastated. I love this church. It was the only church I ever knew.
You can't.
I know, I'm not kidding. I cannot, even to talk about it now brings me more pain than actually talking about the abuse, because the way the church handled that probably added more to my guilt and shame than anything else. Because I can remember thinking as I went through my adult life, and I married, I had 2 children, I volunteered in the schools, I looked like, a model citizen, but I can remember thinking I'm an imposter, because if people really knew what I had done and who I was, they would think differently of me. And I can remember thinking, how bad do you have to be kicked out of a church? And I was kicked out of a church. So that added to my reason to keep the secret as well. And it also added to my guilt and shame. And I also will add, my church was aware of another incident in his first church of sexual abuse when he was hired at our church. So I was not his first victim that they were aware of. And I can assure you, there were more victims than were ever exposed.
This is ridiculous.
Now, I'm gonna give you you're kidding moment. He's still a pastor.
What? No way. That is just travesty. I mean, where is this guy? Do you expose his name?
I don't in the book, and here's the reason why. I did go to I confronted him. I hired a private investigator, and I found him in a church in Alabama, which is the truth. Along with my husband and a counselor and a friend of mine who was at the church at the time, I confronted him. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do. His supervisor, I had a meeting with the supervisor the next day, and this is all in the book, but I had a meeting with the supervisor the next day, and I was told that this man had changed, that my abuse happened 27 years ago, so it had no validity. So then I decided, well, I'm going to write his 11 elders of his church, because no one in his church was aware of his past. So I wrote to his 11 elders expressing my concern that this man remained in ministry and that no one in his congregation was aware of his multiple abuses in his past. I'm going to let you guess how many responded of the 11 elders.
0.
0. So basically, ignore her, she will go away. So then I went to the president of the denomination, which is the Disciples of Christ in Indianapolis. She didn't dismiss me, but she agreed to let me talk to another man who had a board that I could address, which I did. I drove to Indianapolis with my husband and a friend. And there I discussed my concerns again. And this was never about vengeance or trying to get back at him. This was my concern that a man with his past remained in ministry without anyone in the congregation knowing. I was basically told again, well, this happened 27 years ago, and we have no control over who hires and fires in the churches. They have their own power to do that. So their hands were tied. Thank you for coming. Goodbye. So I felt like I had done all I could to expose him. The other reason I have not named him is I actually his wife eventually divorced him after he went to the next church, and again had sexual intercourse with a 21-year-old. She divorced him. I also contacted her 27 years later, and we have a very good relationship. And she asked that I not name him for embarrassment for her and for her children. And so that was my gift to her. But I also didn't want to name him in the beginning, especially when I was doing speaking engagement, because I didn't want the story to just be about him, or people would see this as revenge and that I was trying to get back at him. This is a story about safety in our church. This is a story that needs to be told so that people can understand the dynamics of clergy abuse and how it happens. And it's also a story that needs to be told to churches so that they can respond in an appropriate way and how to handle conduct of these men. So that was the reason I wrote the book, but it's also a couple of the reasons I didn't name him.
Right. The speculation is that if he did change, is that good?
So say that again. I want to understand your question.
So the speculation is that if he did change, would that be good? I mean,
well, certainly if he changes, but he still doesn't remain in ministry. There are ethics in every profession that if you cross that boundary, you lose your profession. So in instance, a stockbroker with inside trading, he can get another job, but he's lost his professional license to be a stockbroker. As a nurse, if I'm a nurse and I'm caught stealing narcotics, I lose my license. Those are boundaries in every profession. And when you allow a man who has devoured one of his sheep and destroyed them spiritually sometimes.
More than one.
Absolutely more than one. But let's just assume you want to assume it's his first time, which I always say, how do you know it's his first time? It's the first time he's gotten caught. But and this isn't about that we can't forgive them. This isn't about that they can't remain within God's love, but it is about that they've lost that privilege of ministry by their own actions. No one is throwing them out or removing them because of some other reason other than the fact that they themselves created this situation. The moment he decided to kiss me in my hallway, that moment, he decided to risk his ministry. And therefore, there should be consequences to that. And there have been none for this man. Now, let me tell you, in my meeting with him, he said he went to counseling and he had been identified as a sexual addict. Now, how in anybody's mind or anybody's world, a man who has admitted to being a sexual addict is now the spiritual leader of your church?
No. Now,
look, he deserves all the grace and love that God gives to all of us, but he deserves it sitting in the third row of the pew in the church, not standing in the pulpit. And if he has committed sexual misconduct or sexual abuse with a minor, it's reported to the police and he should be in jail. That's the end of the discussion. So we don't talk about trying to save him spiritually. We don't make excuses. It is every state it's required that you report it to the police. And churches aren't doing that. I can assure you there are many churches that are not doing that. And especially in our independent churches like the Baptist churches, not to pick on them, but like the Church of Christ that I grew up in or Disciples of Christ, they're independent churches. So they have a little board of elders. And if those elders decide to sweep it under the rug, there's no authority. They will. And there's no authority to report it to.
That's right. That's right. And there are known predators out there of individual churches, denomination, what is it? The non-denominational churches, the
Right.
the the charismatic churches, the real, there's
Evangelical.
oh my gosh, there's just so many different churches out there, but there are also so many different predators. Let's go back a minute. I mean,
Mhm.
as this was happening to you and you weren't really like saying anything, how did that damage you're growing, I mean, you're a growing young lady. How did
Right.
that damage your relationship like that you have with your husband? Did you have to kind of like get some counseling or do something to help you not put what you have, that hatred, that anger onto the next relationship?
I'm probably unusual in that way. I certainly thought about, the moments I would have sex with my husband. I thought about it to some every now and then my abuser would pop into my mind. But my husband was so wonderful, caring, and loving that they were so different and I was so thankful for the relationship that I had with this abuser, that it was over, that I poured everything I had into my relationship with my husband.
Mm,
Um, the, the the damaging part was the fact that I was keeping a secret from him, and the fear that I had for 27 years that he would find out. My fear was, if he ever learned about this affair that I thought I had, he would see me differently sexually. Would he judge me? Would he respond as the church did and blame me? And so those were my fears. And I think it's difficult to have an open, honest relationship with someone when you're constantly hiding something. And so I think it did have an impact on my relationship that way, but not necessarily sexually, which I think is unusual because so many victims that they cannot have a healthy relationship after they've been sexually abused. And they oftentimes will go from partner to partner. Now, I will say, before I met my husband, I was promiscuously sexually. I was very promiscuous because I only saw myself as someone who could be valued only in a sexual way. So when I would go out with someone, I was probably more sexually aggressive. And if sex was a part of the relationship, I easily made it a part of the relationship because that's how I viewed myself. And my self-esteem was so low that I didn't really care. So yeah, that way it was very damaging as well.
yeah, a lot of people don't understand that this is something that's ingrained into you, especially as a young child, when they grow up with these kind of environments, the sexual environment, the drug environment, they believe that this is their environment, that this is what life is.
Right.
And it really isn't. And in order to actually have a good life, you have to incorporate this into your life, or it's not a good life. And it really isn't. My
No,
God.
and you normalize, when part of what I did was during the sexual abuse was I normalized it. I assumed that this was okay, and I accepted it. And so as you go into your adult life, you still accept that as that was a normal thing that happened. And like I said, the guilt and the blame is just, and the shame you feel, it is, to me, was extremely overwhelming at times. I mean, it was very, and then think about this, I have to hide all of this from my friends and my family and my husband. So when I would have a trigger, I had to pretend like everything was okay while I'm exploding inside, and the anxiety is about to overtake me, and I've got to smile and pretend I'm doing okay. And that was very hard for me to do for 27 years. I mean, every time I walked past the minister's office when we went to church, I got a knot in my stomach. And I accepted that as normal, that this was going to happen. When I walked past the minister's office, I was going to get a knot in my stomach. As soon as we sat down and the preacher started praying, I looked down at my shoes and thought about my grocery list. I thought about what I was going to do on Monday. I could not engage a prayer surrounding me. And so it had a tremendous impact on my life in so many ways. Spiritually, it destroyed my spiritual life.
Yeah.
He contaminated the church for me. He took God into a sexual relationship with me. He would have sex with me on Saturday night and then preach on love and marriage on Sunday morning. How does that mess someone's mind? And at the same time telling me we're married in God's eyes. And he had so convinced me of this that I actually bought him a wedding band, and he wore it. And then he told his wife he bought it so that he could show his commitment to her. And the entire time, the congregation has no clue that this is who this man is. And even when he was exposed, there was still this thought, well, he's a good person and he made a mistake. Or look at all the good he has done. And this one mistake shouldn't negate all the good he's done. That kind of thinking is what re-victimizes victims. And it also prevents churches from doing the right thing. Because these men are predators and they will do it again.
It's sad to see this. I mean, we've come a long way with a lot of different things, and we find ourselves in the shadows of regression. And unfortunately, we're not going to get any further unless we normalize that it is a normal occurrence for you to speak up and to tell people and to reiterate what's going on and to keep you out of those certain situations. Even if people don't believe you, just tell them, hey, can I not do this anymore? Can I not be the babysitter? Can I not be alone with this person? Can I not? Or if you feel uncomfortable with this person. So today you have your book. And I just want to make sure that people know where they can go and get it. But most of all, how do you feel today as you have already expressed your feelings and you've exposed what has happened? How do you live today out?
I live my life in the fullest. I live my life out of the shadow of my abuse. It's always going to be a part of me. It will never go away, but I don't live with the guilt and the shame any longer. And let me just say something to victims here. The one thing that you need to understand is this just didn't happen to you. You were targeted and you should have been safe with this person and you weren't. You did the best you could with the coping skills you had at the time, and you had every right to expect that this person would act in your best interest. So take away that guilt and the shame. And the second thing is educate yourself. Learn the terms grooming, manipulation, and all, so you can see what was done to you. Educate yourself. And finally, well, not finally, I think if you can find a support group, but you need to tell someone. And here's the thing about that. I get it. I know how hard it is to tell someone because I waited 27 years to speak my truth. But it's until you can tell someone, and maybe it's to be important if you were abused within the church to find someone outside of the church to tell. Sometimes that people within the church are going to have some sympathy toward the pastor, which is understandable. This is someone they don't know and really know this person. It's a person that baptized their children. It's a person who married them. So it's going to be difficult for them to accept that this person that they idolize and look up to and see as a spiritual leader would be doing such evil acts. But again, don't let yourself be drowned out by guilt and shame. And I live my life because I know I'm not defined by what was done to me. I'm not defined by my abuse. I'm not defined by the lies that he told me. I'm not defined by how my church reacted when they told me to leave. I am defined by the truth that I know and the healing that I have been through to take my life to a point where I'm happy, I'm good, and it's a hard road. I tell victims, healing's not easy. You take 3 steps forward and sometimes 2 steps back, and those triggers come. You can't control those sometimes, but you're not who your abuser told you you were.
Mm, mm, mm. Amazing words from an amazing person. Thank you so much for being on the show. How can people find the book? How can they find you?
My book is available on Amazon, but it's also on my website, which is simply my name, Sandy, S-A-N-D-Y, and then it's Phillips, P-H-I-L-L-I-P-S, and then it's Kirkham, which is Kirkham, which is K-I-R-K-H-A-M. I encourage people to go to the website. There's a lot of good information on there, a lot of resources, not only in the back of my book, but also on my website for people who might want to start to research. And even if you're not a victim of sexual abuse, it's important that you understand the dynamics and why it is so hard for people to say no, or why they didn't say no, or why they waited so long to tell. Because once we start educating others, then they too can be a help to help prevent future abuse when they know how it works.
Definitely, definitely. And also, like you said, to prevent future abuse. But what if something is going on in your family and you haven't noticed the signals, the signs, and all of the things that are going on with your child? They're changing, they're acting out. There's certain touches that they're
Mhm.
not comfortable with anymore. These are signals and signs, and they may not be saying anything, from their mouth, but physically there are always
Right.
kind of something
There's
that
some
can
red
hint to
flags.
something. Yeah, there are some red flags out there that you may not know. And I think that this book will be amazing for you guys to go ahead and get. Yeah. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Sandy, for being on the show. I appreciate it so much. And
Thank
for,
you.
telling your story. I know that it's gotten easier, but it never will be comfortable. And I know that for a fact because I too have endured some abuse as well from other people. And I don't want to get into that, but I just know that if someone would have told me that
Right.
that would have happened to me, I would have been like,
Yeah.
that's not him,
Yeah.
so yeah, you just have to keep your eyes open, even with the people you trust the most.
Correct. Very
Yeah.
good.
I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. Don't forget to go to the website. All of Sandy's information will be in the description box below. It is Sandy Phillips Kirkham, and we're going to have that website in the description box below as well, either above, to the side, or below, wherever you're watching. Thank you guys so much. And if you want to speak out, if this is your moment to say, hey, this has happened to me and you've never told anyone, just go ahead and put down in the comment section below. It's happened to me too. And it doesn't have to say anything else. That's just your beginning. That is your moment that you can begin to actually come out and start your journey, just like Sandy and just like myself. I want to thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Don't forget to dare to be different. And until next time, guys, bye.
I dare to be different. I dare to be different. I dare to be different. I dare to be different.